The envelope was still warm when Mia Costigan opened it, her hands trembling so violently the paper nearly slipped through her fingers, and the words on the hospital letterhead blurred twice before her brain could process what her eyes were seeing. Pregnant, 12 weeks, triplets. Which seemed like a cosmic joke considering she was sitting in a studio apartment that smelled like mildew and instant ramen, wearing a secondhand coat, exactly 4 months after Jack Sullivan's family threw her out of their mansion and called her a barren waste of their precious bloodline. Hey there, beautiful souls. Welcome back to the channel. And wow, do I have a story for you today? This one's got betrayal, secrets, and a comeback that'll make your jaw drop. So tell me quick, where are you watching from right now? Drop your city or country in the comments, because I love seeing where you all are. And hey, if you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Hit that subscribe button, because trust me, you don't want to miss how this unfolds. And make sure you stick around until the end, because the twist in this story is absolutely insane. The rain hammered against Mia's window that November evening as she stared at the ultrasound images spread across her thrift store coffee table. 3 tiny beans floating in grainy black and white. 3 impossible miracles that shouldn't exist according to Ruth Sullivan, who'd stood in the marble foyer of the Sullivan estate and screamed that Mia's womb was broken, useless, an embarrassment to women everywhere. While Jack stood silent on the grand staircase, his eyes on his Italian leather shoes. His spine made of nothing but money and cowardice. The apartment was cold, the heat only working sporadically, and Mia pulled her coat tighter as she remembered the silk sheets she used to sleep in, the heated floors, the bathroom bigger than this entire studio. But what she remembered most clearly was the taste of champagne turning sour in her mouth at that final family dinner when Evelyn Sullivan, Jack's aunt and the family matriarch, had tapped her crystal glass with a silver spoon and announced that they'd consulted with lawyers and found grounds for annulment based on Mia's failure to fulfill the primary purpose of marriage. While 16 relatives sat around that obscenely long dining table and said nothing. Did nothing. Just cut their dry-aged steaks and pretended not to hear Mia's sharp intake of breath. She'd undergone 7 fertility tests in 3 years, each one coming back inconclusive. Nothing definitively wrong, but nothing definitively right either. And Ruth had taken those non-answers and weaponized them, turning every family gathering into a referendum on Mia's worth, her value, her right to exist in their world of old money and older prejudices. The night they threw her out, there'd been thunder, the kind that shook the windows, and Ruth's face had been twisted with something like satisfaction when she'd handed Mia a check. For your trouble, dear. Now please go quietly. As if 3 years of marriage, of love, of trying could be summed up in 5 figures that didn't even have enough zeros. Mia had torn the check in half, the only rebellion she'd managed before the housekeeper, Maria, who'd cried silently, escorted her to the service entrance because God forbid the neighbors see a Sullivan wife leaving through the front door in disgrace. Now, sitting in this apartment in a city 400 miles away from Atlanta, Mia touched her still flat stomach and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Power. The doctor had been confused, apologetic even, when delivering the news, saying something about how these things sometimes happen. The body is mysterious. Stress can affect fertility in both directions. But Mia had barely heard her, because her mind was already spinning, already calculating, already wondering how 3 babies could exist inside someone who'd been declared essentially barren by a family who'd built their reputation on being right about everything. She'd started over in Chicago with nothing but 2 suitcases and a burning determination to prove she was more than someone's failed wife. Enrolling in night classes, working double shifts at a medical research facility, sleeping 4 hours and running on spite and coffee, and somewhere in that chaos of rebuilding herself, Her body had apparently decided to betray every diagnosis, every accusation, every cruel word Ruth Sullivan had ever spoken. The ultrasound tech had done 3 separate scans, called in a supervisor, both of them whispering about multiples and miracle pregnancies while Mia lay there with cold gel on her skin and hot tears sliding into her hair. She picked up her phone now, scrolling to Jack's contact. She hadn't deleted it. Couldn't quite bring herself to erase 3 years, even if they'd ended in ashes. And her thumb hovered over the call button as rain streaked down the window, like the universe was crying for all the time she couldn't. But she didn't call, didn't text, didn't reach out, because some part of her, the part that had clawed its way from broken to building, knew that this information was ammunition, and you didn't fire your weapon before you understood the battlefield. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, cramped with the weight of 3 future lives, and one burning question that Mia couldn't answer, couldn't even fully articulate. How does a barren woman conceive triplets 4 months after her husband's family destroys her? And why did Jack never once suggest that maybe, just maybe, the problem wasn't her at all? Mia's deepest fear wasn't the pregnancy itself, but the voice in her head that sounded exactly like Ruth Sullivan, whispering that somehow she'd still fail, that even 3 babies wouldn't be enough to prove she wasn't defective, that the Sullivan family would find a way to twist this miracle into another reason she was inadequate, wrong, less than. She'd been staring at her reflection in the bathroom mirror for 10 minutes when her phone buzzed with a text from Sophia Montgomery, the only person from her old life who'd bothered to check if she was still breathing after the Sullivans erased her from their world like a typo in their perfect narrative. Coffee tomorrow? I'm in Chicago for a deposition. Please tell me you're surviving. Sophia was a corporate lawyer with a spine of reinforced steel and a loyalty that bordered on feral. They'd met at Northwestern, back when Mia was pre-med, and thought she'd become a doctor before Jack Sullivan walked into that charity gala and rewrote her entire future with his devastating smile and promises that turned out to have expiration dates. Mia texted back, 10 a.m., Brewster's on 5th, and I have news that'll make your head explode. And felt the first genuine smile in months tug at her mouth, because if anyone would understand the cosmic irony of this situation, it was Sophia who'd warned her the Sullivans were old money sociopaths with good PR. The next morning, Sophia took one look at Mia across the coffee shop table and said, "You're either pregnant or you've joined a cult." And honestly, I'm not sure which would shock me more. Her dark eyes sharp with the kind of perception that made her deadly in courtrooms and invaluable as a friend. Mia slid the ultrasound images across the table without a word, watching Sophia's expressions cycle through confusion, shock, understanding, and then pure rage in the space of 5 seconds. "Those absolute bastards," Sophia breathed, her perfectly manicured nails tapping the image of 3 tiny forms. "Ruth Sullivan called you Barren in front of half of Atlanta's elite, and now you're carrying triplets. Mia, when did this happen?" The question Mia had been asking herself in every quiet moment. The math that didn't quite add up no matter how many times she calculated it. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice small in a way she hated. "The doctor said I'm 12 weeks. Which means conception happened right around when they threw you out," Sophia finished, her lawyer brain already assembling timelines and evidence. "Had you and Jack." 3 days before the final dinner," Mia confirmed, remembering that last desperate attempt at connection. Jack's hands on her skin, his mouth against her neck. The way he'd whispered, "I love you. We'll figure this out." Like a prayer he didn't actually believe would be answered. He initiated it. Actually, said he didn't care what the test showed, that we were more than this pressure. And then, 72 hours later, he stood there silent, while his mother handed me a check, and his aunt called me a biological dead end. Sophia's jaw tightened. That dangerous expression that meant someone was about to get legally eviscerated. We need to talk about what you want here, because this information is a nuclear weapon, Mia, and how you deploy it matters. What did she want? Mia had been running from that question for 4 months, burying it under work shifts and course syllabi, and the sheer exhausting effort of surviving. But now, with 3 lives growing inside her and Sophia's unflinching gaze demanding honesty, she couldn't hide anymore. I want them to know they were wrong, she said quietly, the words tasting like vindication and fear mixed together. I want to walk back into their world, with my head high and my children visible, and watch Ruth Sullivan's face when she realizes she threw out the only grandchildren the Sullivan line is ever going to get. Something flickered in Sophia's expression, a hesitation that looked wrong on someone usually so certain. About that, Mia, there's something you should know. Something I heard through the legal grapevine about 6 months ago, but didn't tell you because you were already drowning. The coffee shop suddenly felt too warm, too crowded. The espresso machines hiss like a warning. Jack's parents tried to have a second child for years after he was born, Sophia continued, her voice low and careful. Multiple fertility treatments, different specialists, the whole 9 yards, and nothing ever took. His father, Richard Sullivan, supposedly had some kind of genetic condition, really rare, something that affects male fertility, and there were rumors, just rumors, but persistent ones, that Jack had the same markers. The floor tilted under Mia's chair, the puzzle pieces rearranging themselves into a picture that made her stomach clench. If Jack knew he wasn't fertile, she said slowly, each word deliberate as the implications crystallized, then every test I took, every accusation Ruth made, every humiliation was a lie, Sophia finished, her eyes blazing. A calculated misdirection to protect the Sullivan reputation, because God forbid anyone know their golden boy heir was firing blanks. Mia's hand went to her stomach, protective and possessive, and for the first time since seeing those test results, a different question formed. If Jack couldn't father children, then whose DNA was currently dividing and growing into 3 separate miracles? And why did the timeline of her conception align so perfectly with the night everything fell apart? The DNA couldn't be Jack's. That's what Mia kept thinking as she sat in Dr. Ethan Hunt's office at Chicago Memorial Hospital 2 weeks after the coffee shop revelation, her medical records spread across his desk like evidence at a crime scene. And when the fertility specialist looked up at her with an expression somewhere between fascination and concern, she knew her life was about to detonate again. Ms. Costigan, Dr. Hunt said carefully, adjusting his glasses in that way doctors do when they're about to say something that'll reshape your reality. I've reviewed your previous fertility tests from Atlanta, and I need to ask you something sensitive. During your marriage, did your husband ever undergo a sperm analysis? The question landed like a punch, because no, Jack had never been tested. Every doctor's appointment had been for her. Every invasive procedure and blood draw and humiliating examination had been Mia's burden to carry, while Jack waited in expensive lounges and pretended to be supportive. The Sullivan family doctor said there was no need, Mia heard herself say, the words tasting like ash. That, statistically, when conception doesn't occur, is the woman's issue 70% of the time. And my tests kept coming back inconclusive, so we should just keep trying. Dr. Hunt's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. That's medically irresponsible and frankly outdated thinking. But more importantly, given what I'm seeing in your current blood work and the triplet pregnancy, I think we need to consider a possibility that might be difficult to hear. The office walls seemed to contract, the morning sunlight through the windows suddenly too bright, too exposing. Your hormone levels, your ovarian reserve, everything indicates you have perfectly normal, Actually, quite robust fertility, he continued, pulling up charts on his computer screen. Which means if conception wasn't occurring in your marriage, the issue was almost certainly male factor. And if you're now pregnant with triplets, we need to establish paternity and timeline with absolute certainty. Mia's throat went dry as the implication crystallized into accusation. I never cheated on Jack. Not once in 3 years. I wouldn't. I'm not suggesting infidelity, Dr. Hunt interrupted gently but firmly. I'm suggesting something potentially more complicated. You said conception occurred approximately 12 weeks ago, right around the time your marriage ended. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and watched him pull up a calendar, counting backwards with clinical precision. Were you undergoing any medical procedures during that time? Any fertility treatments, inseminations, even a routine gynecological exam? The memory hit her like cold water. The appointment at Sullivan Medical Center 3 days before that final family dinner. Ruth insisting she see the best reproductive specialist in Atlanta for one more round of tests. The procedure room with its sterile smell and colder instruments. The doctor, Dr. Patricia Chen, a family friend of the Sullivans, saying something about a new diagnostic technique that required a minor intervention. Mia had been so desperate, so willing to try anything. She'd signed the consent forms without reading them thoroughly. Let them sedate her lightly. Woke up groggy with Dr. Chen patting her hand and saying, "Let's hope this gives us some answers, dear." Oh my God, Mia breathed, her hands shaking as the puzzle pieces assembled into a picture so insane she could barely articulate it. They did something to me, some kind of procedure, and I was too drugged to fully understand what. And then 3 days later, Jack and I. Her voice broke as a violation and possibility warred in her chest. Dr. Hunt leaned forward, his expression shifting from clinical to concerned. Mia, I need you to authorize a formal investigation into your medical records from that facility. Because if what you're suggesting is true, if someone performed an unauthorized fertility procedure, that's not just malpractice, that's assault. The word hung in the air like a blade, sharp and terrible. And Mia felt something crack open inside her. Not breaking, but hatching, something fierce and protective emerging from the shell of who she used to be. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown Atlanta number. Mia, it's Jack. Sophia told my secretary she met with you in Chicago. We need to talk. My mother is sick and asking for you. Please. The audacity made her laugh, a sharp, bitter sound that startled them both, because Ruth Sullivan could be on her deathbed, and Mia still wouldn't forget the woman's face when she'd called her useless, broken, unworthy of the Sullivan name. But then another text came through, this one from Sophia. Don't respond to Jack yet. I just found out something about the Sullivan Medical Center. And they had a program 5 years ago. Experimental fertility research using donor genetic material. Jack's twin brother Lucas donated before he died in that car accident. Mia, I think you need to get your hands on those consent forms you signed. The floor dropped out from under everything Mia thought she understood about her pregnancy, her marriage, the night she was thrown out into the rain, because Jack had a twin brother who died 2 years before they met. Lucas Sullivan, whose death was apparently tragic enough that the family never spoke about him, and if his genetic material had been stored at the same facility where Dr. Chen performed that mysterious procedure, then the 3 babies growing inside her might share Jack's DNA without Jack being their father at all. Dr. Hunt was watching her carefully, probably seeing the shock written across her face. What do you want to do, Mia? The question felt monumental, weighted with futures she couldn't fully imagine yet. But when she looked down at her still flat stomach and thought about Ruth Sullivan calling her Barren, about Jack's silence on that staircase, about 3 years of blame and shame that was never hers to carry, The answer crystallized with diamond-hard clarity. "I want proof," she said, her voice steady, despite the earthquake in her chest. "I want every medical record, every consent form, every piece of evidence about what they did to me and why. And then I want to go back to Atlanta and watch their world burn when the truth comes out." Getting the medical records from Sullivan Medical Center turned into a war of attrition that stretched across 6 weeks, with Mia's belly beginning to show and her fury growing in direct proportion to every denied request, every lost file, every patronizing receptionist who claimed Dr. Patricia Chen was unavailable for comment. And it was during her 4th attempt to physically enter the medical center's records department that she literally collided with Dr. Ethan Hunt in the parking garage, his arm steadying her before she stumbled, his eyes widening when he registered her presence in Atlanta. "What are you doing here?" they said simultaneously. And despite everything, Mia felt a laugh bubble up at the absurdity at finding her Chicago fertility specialist outside the very building that held the answers she was hunting. Ethan released her shoulders quickly, professional distance reasserting itself. But something in his expression told her this wasn't coincidence. "I'm consulting on a medical ethics case," he said carefully, glancing around the concrete structure like someone might be listening. "Someone filed an anonymous complaint about the reproductive medicine program that operated here 5 years ago. Alleged violations of consent protocols, and the hospital board brought me in to review historical files. The universe was either conspiring for her or against her. Mia couldn't decide which." "That anonymous complaint was my lawyer," she admitted, watching his face for judgment and finding only a flicker of something warmer, something almost like admiration. "Sophia filed it 2 weeks ago, hoping it would force them to open the archives. But they've been stonewalling every official request, every subpoena, every attempt to get answers about what they did to me." Ethan's jaw tightened, and he pulled out his phone, typing rapidly. "I have clearance to access those files as of this morning. Full investigative authority. And while I can't legally share confidential patient information with you..." He paused, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I can certainly inform a patient if I discover evidence of medical misconduct that directly affected her treatment." It wasn't quite breaking the rules, but it was bending them into shapes that could snap. And the fact that this by-the-book specialist was willing to risk professional consequences for her made something warm unfurl in Mia's chest. Dangerous and entirely inappropriate, given she was pregnant with potential, maybe possibly her dead brother-in-law's triplets. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly, needing to understand his motivation before she let herself trust this fragile alliance. Ethan was quiet for a moment, his hand rubbing the back of his neck in a gesture that seemed uncharacteristically uncertain. "Because I had a sister who went through 7 years of fertility treatment, had 3 different doctors tell her she was the problem, that her body was failing her, and it destroyed her marriage, and nearly destroyed her before someone finally tested her husband and found out he had a 0 sperm count." His voice carried an edge of old anger, old grief. "She never recovered from that psychological damage, from internalizing all that blame. And when I read your file, when I saw the pattern of testing only you, never him, I recognized the same medical gaslighting. And I won't let that stand unchallenged." The parking garage felt smaller suddenly, intimate despite the echo of distant traffic, and Mia found herself noticing details she'd tried to ignore during their clinical appointments. The way Ethan's eyes were more green than brown, in natural light, the slight scar on his chin, the fact that he'd driven 4 hours from Chicago to Atlanta on a weekend for a consulting case he could have easily declined. "Thank you," she said, inadequate words for the lifeline he was offering, and when their eyes held a beat too long, she saw him recognize the charge between them at the same moment she did, saw him deliberately step back and rebuild that professional wall. "I should go," he said, his voice a shade too controlled. "I have a meeting with the board in 20 minutes. But Mia, stay in the area today. If I find what I think I'm going to find, you'll want to know immediately." He disappeared into the stairwell, leaving Mia alone with her racing heart and the uncomfortable realization that she was attracted to her doctor, which was frankly the least complicated problem on her current disaster list, but still felt like a betrayal of something she couldn't quite name. Her phone buzzed. Jack again. The fifth call this week that she'd ignored. But this time there was a voicemail, and against her better judgment, she listened to his voice for the first time in 7 months. "Mia, please. I know I don't deserve your time, but my mother really is sick. Stage 4, pancreatic cancer. And she's saying things, confessing things about the family that I think you need to hear." His voice cracked slightly. Exhaustion evident in every syllable. "I'm starting to realize how much I didn't know, how much they kept from both of us. And if there's any chance you can find it in yourself to let me explain, I'm staying at the Residence Inn on Peachtree, room 412, and I'll wait as long as it takes." The message ended, and Mia stood there, torn between the woman who'd loved Jack enough to endure 3 years of systematic degradation and the woman she was becoming, who knew that some doors, once closed, should stay locked forever. A text from Sophia interrupted her spiral. "Just heard from my contact at the hospital. They're trying to transfer the old reproductive program files to an off-site storage facility tonight, probably to bury them. Whatever you're doing, do it fast." Mia was dialing Ethan before she consciously decided to, her instinct overriding protocol, and he answered on the first ring with, "I know. I just found out. They're moving the files at 8 p.m., and my access authorization conveniently gets revoked at 7. So we have 1 hour to find 5-year-old records in a facility that doesn't want us to find them," Mia said, already moving toward the building entrance, adrenaline sharpening her focus to a razor's edge. "Not we," Ethan corrected. "I have authorization. You're a civilian and could be charged with trespassing. And you're pregnant with triplets, which means you shouldn't be—" He stopped talking, because Mia had appeared beside him at the records department door, her chin lifted in defiant determination, and something in his expression shifted from resistance to resignation to reluctant partnership. "You're impossible," he muttered. But he was already swiping his credentials and holding the door open. "Impossibly motivated," Mia corrected, stepping into the climate-controlled warehouse of medical secrets, with her heart hammering and her hands steady, ready to excavate the truth from whatever grave the Sullivans had tried to bury it in. The file was buried in a box marked Discontinued Programs, 2018 and 2019, in the back corner of the third-floor archive. And when Ethan pulled it out with hands that had started shaking somewhere between the second and third dead-end box, Mia knew from his face that everything was about to change. "Oh, God," he whispered, flipping through pages with increasing speed, his clinical composure fracturing with each document. And when he finally looked at her, his eyes were blazing with a fury so intense it was almost fear. "Mia, you need to sit down for this." But she couldn't sit, couldn't breathe, could only watch as he spread the contents across a dusty table. Consent forms with her signature, medical charts she'd never seen, and a file labeled Patient, Sullivan Jack, Genetic Infertility Diagnosis, Confidential, dated 3 months before their wedding. The room tilted sideways as Mia grabbed the file, her eyes scanning words that rewrote her entire marriage. Klinefelter syndrome variant, azoospermia, 0 sperm count, patient informed of infertility status. Patient's mother, Ruth Sullivan, present during consultation, discussed options including donor conception and adoption. Patient declined disclosure to fiancé. Jack had known. For 3 years of tests and accusations, and her body being treated like a crime scene, Jack had known he was shooting blanks and said nothing. Let her believe she was broken while he carried the truth like a loaded gun he never fired. "There's more," Ethan said quietly, pulling out another document This one stamped with Dr. Patricia Chen's signature and dated exactly 1 week before Mia was thrown out. Authorization for experimental fertility intervention using cryopreserved donor genetic material, donor designation, Lucas Sullivan, deceased. Samples collected 2016 for research purposes. Recipient, Mia Costigan Sullivan. Procedure, intrauterine insemination. Authorization signature, Ruth Sullivan. Medical power of attorney. The words swam before Mia's eyes as the full picture crystallized into something so calculated, so monstrously orchestrated, it stole the oxygen from her lungs. They used Jack's dead twin brother's sperm to inseminate me without my informed consent, she said, each word landing like a stone in still water, ripples of violation spreading outward. Ruth knew Jack was infertile, couldn't risk the Sullivan bloodline ending, so she had them impregnate me with Lucas's genetic material and then threw me out before I could discover I was pregnant, so the family could maintain their reputation while getting rid of the barren wife who knew too many secrets. Ethan was reading another page, his face going progressively paler. Mia, according to this, Ruth didn't just authorize the procedure. She specifically instructed Dr. Chen to wait until you were in the optimal window for conception, then arranged for Jack to be dosed with a mild aphrodisiac at that final family dinner to ensure he'd initiate intercourse, creating plausible, natural paternity. The clinical language describing her assault, her husband being drugged, the systematic manipulation of her body, and her marriage made Mia's hands curl into fists so tight her nails drew blood from her palms. This was all planned, she breathed, horror and rage mixing into something combustible. The procedure, the dinner, throwing me out. Ruth orchestrated everything so I'd leave pregnant with Sullivan genetics, but without the legal protection of the marriage, probably planning to come for the children later once they were born, and I was desperate enough to give them up. Ethan's hand found hers, warm and grounding, and she realized she was shaking so hard the papers were rustling. "This is criminal," he said, his voice low and fierce. "Medical assault, fraud, conspiracy. Mia, this documentation is enough to destroy the Sullivan family and put Ruth in prison, and I will personally testify to its authenticity." She looked up at him, this man who'd driven hours to fight for her, who was holding her hand in the dusty archive like an anchor in a hurricane, and something shifted between them, the professional distance evaporating in the heat of shared outrage, and a connection that felt inevitable. "Why do you even care this much?" she asked, her voice breaking. "You barely know me. I'm just another patient with a complicated case. Why risk your career for this?" Ethan's other hand came up to cup her face, gentle despite the fury still blazing in his eyes. "Because watching you fight for the truth, seeing you refuse to accept their narrative about your worth, reminds me that medicine is supposed to heal people, not weaponize their bodies for someone else's agenda," he said, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. "And because somewhere between reviewing your files and watching you walk into this building ready to burn it down for answers, you stopped being just a patient and became someone I can't stop thinking about. Which is terrible timing and completely inappropriate. But apparently, I'm confessing things now." The kiss happened before Mia could overthink it, her mouth finding his in the space between revelation and revolution, tasting like desperation and hope, and the reckless intimacy of two people who just uncovered a conspiracy together. He kissed her back for 3 heartbeats, before pulling away, breathing hard, his forehead resting against hers. "We can't," he whispered, but his hands were still cradling her face like something precious. "You're pregnant and processing trauma, and I'm supposed to be your doctor. This is every ethical boundary I've ever—" "I'm firing you as my doctor," Mia interrupted, surprised by her own clarity. "Effective immediately. I'll find someone else in Chicago, but right now, in this moment, I need you to be the person who sees me as more than a victim or a patient or a walking lawsuit." His eyes searched hers, looking for certainty in the chaos, and whatever he found there made his resolve crumble. "After this is over, when you've had time to process and heal and not be standing in the middle of the worst discovery of your life, ask me again," he said softly. "Because I want this, want you, but not when you're looking for an anchor in a storm, only when you're choosing me from solid ground." The maturity of it, the respect embedded in his restraint, made Mia fall a little bit in love with him right there among the dusty boxes and damning evidence. Before she could respond, both their phones buzzed simultaneously. Sophia's text in all caps. "Ruth Sullivan just publicly announced she's donating $50 million to open a fertility research center in the family's name. Press conference at 9 p.m. This is her move to look like a saint. Before you can expose her, we need to act now." Mia looked at the files spread across the table, at Ethan's fierce protective expression, at her own reflection in the darkened window, showing a woman who'd been broken and reassembled into something stronger, and felt the final piece of her plan click into place. "I'm going to that press conference," she said, her voice diamond hard with purpose. "And I'm going to stand up in front of Atlanta's media elite with this documentation and watch Ruth Sullivan's sainthood turn to ashes in real time." Mia never made it to the press conference because at 7:45 p.m., 15 minutes before she and Sophia were supposed to walk into the Sullivan Foundation ballroom with evidence that would detonate the family's reputation, 2 Atlanta police officers appeared at her hotel room door with a warrant for her arrest on charges of breaking and entering Sullivan Medical Center, theft of confidential medical records, and this one made her vision blur with disbelief. Practicing medicine without a license by posing as Dr. Chen's patient to gain unauthorized access to facility databases. The charges were fiction, elaborate lies constructed by someone with enough money and influence to make fiction look like fact. And as the handcuffs clicked around Mia's wrists, she watched Sophia's face cycle through shock to fury, to the grim calculation that meant they'd been outplayed. "Don't say anything," Sophia ordered, as they led Mia toward the elevator, already on her phone with the bail bondsman. But the real blow came when they reached the lobby, and Mia saw Jack standing near the entrance with his mother's attorney, Theodore Morrison, whose smile was all predator and no warmth. "Mia," Jack said, and he had the audacity to look pained, conflicted, like he wasn't actively participating in her destruction. "This didn't have to happen if you'd just returned my calls, if you'd been reasonable." "Reasonable?" The word came out like broken glass, sharp enough to make Jack flinch. "Your mother had me inseminated without my consent, threw me out calling me Barren, and now you're having me arrested for discovering the truth." Where exactly was reasonable supposed to fit in that timeline, Jack? Something flickered in his expression. Guilt, maybe, or the ghost of the man she'd thought she married. But Theodore stepped between them with the smooth intervention of someone paid 7 figures to make problems disappear. "Mrs. Sullivan, and you are still legally Mrs. Sullivan since the annulment was never finalized, has made a generous offer," he said, pulling out a document that looked freshly printed. "Drop all allegations against the Sullivan family. Sign an NDA regarding any medical procedures you believe occurred. Relinquish all parental rights to any children you're currently carrying. And in exchange, we'll drop the criminal charges and provide a settlement of $5 million, a house anywhere outside Georgia, and a trust fund for your future." The offer landed like a physical blow. The price tag they'd put on her silence and her children, and Mia understood with sickening clarity that Ruth Sullivan had spent the hours since the files were discovered building a legal cage so comprehensive that fighting back meant losing everything. "And if I refuse?" she asked, though the officer's hands on her arms already told her the answer. Then you'll be processed into the Fulton County jail system tonight, held pending trial on charges that carry 2 to 5 years prison time, during which you'll give birth in a county hospital under guard, and the Sullivan family will file for emergency custody of 3 infants born to an incarcerated mother with no support system, no resources, and a documented history of mental instability. Theodore's smile widened at Mia's sharp intake of breath. Oh, yes, we have affidavits from 3 psychiatrists willing to testify that your claims of unauthorized medical procedures are delusional ideation brought on by the trauma of infertility, that you've constructed an elaborate conspiracy theory to avoid accepting your own biological limitations. They'd thought of everything, weaponized every vulnerability, turned her truth into pathology and her evidence into theft, and the crushing weight of institutional power aligned against one pregnant woman with no money and a lawyer who was already whispering, Mia, we might need to consider tactical retreat, made her knees buckle. The officers caught her before she fell, their grips impersonal and efficient, and through the hotel's glass doors, Mia could see news vans pulling up for what should have been Ruth Sullivan's charity announcement, but would probably become a story about a disturbed ex-wife making false accusations. Her phone buzzed in the evidence bag the officers were sealing, Ethan's name on the screen, and Theodore noticed her reaction with predatory interest. Dr. Hunt has already been contacted by the Georgia Medical Board about his involvement in unauthorized access to confidential files, he said conversationally, like discussing weather instead of destroying lives. His medical license is under emergency review, and there's some question about whether his relationship with you has crossed professional boundaries, which would be particularly damaging for someone who consults on medical ethics cases. They were taking Ethan too, pulling apart the one alliance that had made her feel less alone, and Mia felt the fight drain out of her, like water from a broken vessel, because she could survive being destroyed, but she couldn't let him lose everything for helping her. If I sign, she heard herself say, the words tasting like surrender and ash. You leave Dr. Hunt alone. Drop any investigation into his license, and guarantee in writing that he faces no professional consequences. Sophia grabbed her arm, fierce and desperate. Mia, no, we can fight this. Don't let them take your children. But Mia was looking at Jack, searching his face for any remnant of the man who'd whispered promises in the dark, and finding only a stranger wearing his features. Did you know, she asked quietly, when your mother had me arrested, when Theodore drafted that agreement, did you know about the insemination, about Lucas's sperm, about any of it? Jack's silence was answer enough, the way his eyes slid away from hers, and something inside Mia that had been cracked finally shattered completely. I need to think, she said to Theodore, hating the defeat in her voice. I have 72 hours before arraignment. Give me until tomorrow morning. Theodore nodded like he'd already won, which he probably had, and as the officers led Mia toward the police car, she caught a glimpse of her reflection in the hotel's mirrored facade. A pregnant woman in handcuffs, alone and outgunned, looking exactly like the broken victim the Sullivans had always accused her of being. Her phone buzzed again in the evidence bag, Ethan's call going to voicemail, and Mia closed her eyes against the tears. Because the cruelest part wasn't the handcuffs, or the charges, or even the choice between her children and her freedom. It was the voice in her head that sounded like Ruth Sullivan, whispering that maybe they were right, maybe she was defective after all. Not in her body, but in her fundamental belief that truth and justice could ever triumph over money and power, and a family willing to burn the world to protect their secrets. Mia spent exactly 4 hours in the holding cell at Fulton County Jail before the guard unlocked the door and said, Your bail's been posted. Someone's here for you. And she expected Sophia, but instead found Ethan Hunt standing in the processing area, looking like he'd driven 4 hours at illegal speeds, with his hair disheveled and his eyes blazing with the kind of fury that moves mountains. "You don't get to martyr yourself for my medical license," he said the moment she was close enough to hear, not touching her, but vibrating with an intensity that made her chest tight. "I've been practicing medicine for 12 years, and if that career ends because I helped expose medical assault, then it was a career worth ending. But I will not let you sign away your children to protect me from consequences I'm willing to face." Sophia appeared behind him, her expression tight with exhausted triumph. "Before you ask how we made bail, when Theodore probably called every bondsman in Atlanta, you should know that your case just became significantly more complicated for the Sullivans because Dr. Patricia Chen apparently grew a conscience around 2 a.m. and walked into my office with her own copies of the files, a signed affidavit confessing to the unauthorized insemination, and a recording of Ruth Sullivan explicitly ordering her to get that girl pregnant with Lucas's samples and keep your mouth shut about it." The words took a moment to penetrate the fog of Mia's exhaustion, but when they did, hope flared like a match in darkness. "Why would Dr. Chen confess now?" she asked, afraid to believe in rescue that seemed too convenient. Sophia's smile was sharp as a knife. "Because Ruth Sullivan's stage 4 cancer isn't just killing her, it's apparently making her confess sins like a deathbed conversion. And when she told Patricia that God would forgive them both for what they did to that Barren girl, Patricia realized she was about to be the sole scapegoat for a conspiracy she'd been coerced into." Ethan pulled out his phone, showing Mia a video file. "Dr. Chen also provided this security footage from the medical center showing Ruth Sullivan entering the records department yesterday at 6 p.m. and leaving with boxes marked for destruction, which directly contradicts her sworn statement that she had no knowledge of any reproductive program files." The pieces were falling into place, the cage Ruth had built showing its weak points, and Mia felt something uncurl in her chest that had been locked down since the handcuffs clicked. "So, the charges are being reviewed by a prosecutor who just discovered the alleged victim. Ruth Sullivan may have filed a false police report," Sophia finished. "Theodore Morrison is currently in damage control mode, and Jack—" She paused, her expression softening slightly. "Jack apparently showed up at my office an hour after you were arrested, looking like hell, and said, 'I need to know the truth, all of it, because I think my mother has been lying to me my entire life.'" Mia's heart did something complicated at that revelation, but before she could process it, Ethan's hand found hers, warm and solid and grounding. "There's something else you need to know," he said quietly. "I ran a genetic panel on the samples from Lucas Sullivan's donor files, cross-referenced them with Jack's medical records that Dr. Chen provided, and Maya, Lucas and Jack weren't identical twins." The floor shifted under her feet as the implication crystallized. "The family always said they were identical," she breathed. "Every story, every photo comparison. Ruth always talked about how she couldn't tell them apart as babies." "They were fraternal twins," Ethan confirmed, his medical precision cutting through decades of Sullivan mythology, which means Jack's infertility wasn't genetic at all. It was the result of childhood mumps that caused testicular damage when he was 9, documented in his pediatric records, but apparently never explained to him as having fertility implications. The final piece of the puzzle locked into place with sickening clarity. Ruth knew Jack could father children if his condition was treated early, but she let it progress untreated because she could use his infertility as cover, Mia said, the calculated cruelty of it stealing her breath. She could control the bloodline completely, choose exactly whose genetics continued the Sullivan line, and blame any conception problems on the wives. Sophia nodded grimly. "And when you proved too resilient, too willing to keep trying, she switched tactics, used Lucas's samples to create Sullivan heirs she could control while eliminating you from the equation. before you discovered the pregnancy. The scope of the manipulation, the years of orchestrated lies, should have broken Mia, but instead she felt something crystallize inside her that was harder than diamond and twice as sharp. Absolute clarity about what came next. "Where's Jack now?" she asked, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "Waiting outside," Ethan said carefully. "He knows about the insemination, about his mother's conspiracy, about Lucas not being identical, and Mia, I think he's finally seeing what was done to both of you." The protective note in Ethan's voice when he said "both of you" made Mia look up at him, really look, and see the fear hiding behind his fierce defense. That she might go back to Jack, might choose the history over the future, might walk away from whatever was building between them in favor of the man who'd let her be destroyed. She stood on her toes and kissed him, brief and fierce and deliberate. Right there in the police station with Sophia smirking and security cameras recording. "That's not me choosing you on unstable ground," she said against his mouth. "That's me telling you to wait for me while I go confront my husband, get my damn annulment finalized, and burn down the empire that tried to bury me." Ethan's smile was sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "I'll be right here when you're done." Mia turned to Sophia, feeling pieces of herself she'd thought were broken, reassembling into something stronger, better, sharper than before. "Set up a meeting with Jack, somewhere public with witnesses, and tell Theodore Morrison that I'm not signing anything until I hear Ruth Sullivan confess every lie to my face." "She's in hospice," Sophia warned. "Probably has weeks at most, barely conscious." "Then she better use whatever time she has left to tell the truth," Mia said, her hand moving to her stomach where 3 lives were growing. 3 miracles that proved every accusation against her had been fiction. "Because I'm going back to that family with my head high and my children visible, and I'm going to watch them all realize that the barren, useless, broken woman they threw away is the only reason the Sullivan bloodline survives at all." The hospice room smelled like antiseptic and approaching death, and Ruth Sullivan looked smaller than Mia remembered, diminished by cancer and morphine. But when those sharp eyes focused on Mia, standing in the doorway with her 19-week pregnant belly visible under a fitted dress, the hatred that flashed across the dying woman's face was strong enough to prove some poisons outlive the body. "You," Ruth rasped, her voice like gravel scraping bone. "You're supposed to be in jail, broken, gone." "I'm supposed to be a lot of things according to you," Mia interrupted, walking into the room with Sophie on her left, Ethan on her right, and Jack standing by the window looking like a man watching his entire reality collapse. "Barren, useless, a biological dead end. But apparently, I'm pregnant with triplets. Which is funny because you threw me out for being infertile." She pulled out the medical files, dropping them on Ruth's bedside table with a slap that made the dying woman flinch. "Want to explain how a barren woman conceived 3 babies, Ruth? Or should I read directly from Dr. Chen's confession about you ordering her to inseminate me with your dead son's sperm?" The room went absolutely silent, except for the beep of monitors and Ruth's labored breathing, and Mia watched Jack's face drain of color as the reality he'd been avoiding crystallized into something he couldn't deny. "You used Lucas," he said, his voice breaking on his twin's name. "You took his genetic material, and Mom, what did you do?" Ruth's laugh was bitter, wet with fluid and her lungs couldn't expel. "I saved the Sullivan bloodline because you couldn't. Because your father's weak genetics made you defective. And I wasn't going to let generations of wealth and power die because my son shoots blanks." The cruelty of it, delivered with her last breaths, made even Sophia inhale sharply, but Mia felt nothing but cold satisfaction as the confession spilled out. "I tried to get you treated when you were young," Ruth continued, her eyes on Jack now, justifying herself to the end. After the mumps damaged you, I consulted specialists, but they said the window had passed, that you'd never father children naturally. And I couldn't. I wouldn't let that be our legacy. So I kept Lucas's samples after he died. Insurance for when you inevitably married someone and the truth came out. Jack's hand gripped the window frame hard enough that his knuckles went white. So you let me believe I was fine. Let Maya undergo years of testing and humiliation. Let me blame her. She was supposed to leave quietly, Ruth snapped, stronger suddenly with the fury of someone losing control of their final chapter. Take the settlement, disappear, and then, in a few years, I would have found her, offered her money for the children, told her she was unfit, and brought the heirs home where they belonged, without the complication of a mother who knew too much. The premeditation of it, the calculated cruelty spanning years, made Mia's hands shake, but she kept her voice steady. Except I didn't disappear quietly, and now everyone's going to know the truth, because we're not in this room alone, Ruth. She gestured to her phone propped on the side table, screen showing a live stream to a private YouTube channel where Sophia's paralegal was recording every word. And to the hospital administrator standing in the doorway with security, witness to a deathbed confession that was also a sworn testimony. Ruth's eyes widened, the machines around her beeping faster as her blood pressure spiked. You can't. That's illegal recording. Medical privacy. You waived privacy when you filed false criminal charges against me, Sophia said, with the precision of a surgeon making the killing cut. This recording is evidence in an active legal case, admissible in both criminal and civil court. And in about 45 seconds, it's also going to be evidence in a press conference happening downstairs, where Dr. Chen, Dr. Hunt, and 3 independent medical experts are explaining to Atlanta's media how you orchestrated medical assault, fraud, and conspiracy. The color that flooded Ruth's face was apoplectic rage, biting cardiac distress, and for a moment Mia thought she might actually witness the woman die from sheer fury. But the nurse who rushed in stabilized her enough to hear the final blow. The Sullivan Foundation Board voted this morning to remove your name from all charitable programs, Mia said, leaning close enough to see her own reflection in Ruth's dilated pupils. The fertility research center you were going to name after yourself. They're calling it the Lucas Sullivan Memorial Center for Ethical Reproductive Medicine, and I'm going to be on the advisory board, making sure no woman ever experiences what you put me through. She straightened, placing one hand on her belly where Ruth's grandchildren were growing, living proof of every lie the woman had told. So you can die, knowing that I won, that your precious bloodline survives through me, the woman you called defective, and that history will remember you not as a philanthropist, but as the monster who assaulted her daughter-in-law and destroyed her own son's marriage to hide her crimes. Ruth's mouth opened, closed, her hand reaching out with something that might have been pleading or cursing. But Mia had already turned away, done giving this woman her attention, her pain, her power. Jack caught her arm in the hallway, his face wet with tears she had no interest in interpreting. Mia, I'm so sorry. I should have known, should have questioned, should have protected you. Yes, you should have, she agreed, gently removing his hand from her arm. But you chose silence over courage, your mother over your wife, and that's something I can forgive eventually but never forget. She pulled out the annulment papers Sophia had prepared, signed and notarized. You're free, Jack. Free to live your life without the pressure of heirs or expectations. And these babies are mine, legally and completely, because the donor consent forms Lucas signed specifically waived paternal rights for any reproductive use of his genetic material. Jack's face crumbled as the finality of it hit him. Could I at least meet them someday? Not as a father, but as... We'll see, Mia said, softer than he deserved, but harder than she used to be. Maybe when they're old enough to understand the whole story, and decide for themselves if they want you in their lives. But Jack, you don't get to be their savior or their secret or their second chance. You get to be the cautionary tale I tell them about choosing courage over comfort. She walked away from him, from the hospice room, from 3 years of her life that had been built on lies, and found Ethan waiting by the elevator with an expression that said he'd heard everything through the phone recording and was looking at her like she'd just hung the moon. "That was the most magnificent thing I've ever witnessed," he said quietly, his hand finding hers as the elevator doors closed on the wreckage of the Sullivan family legacy. "Remind me never to cross you." Mia laughed, the sound surprising them both with its genuine joy. "You're the one person who has nothing to worry about, because you chose me when choosing me cost you something. And that's worth more than all the Sullivan money combined." The elevator descended toward the lobby where cameras were waiting, where the truth was about to become public record, where Mia Costigan was about to step into her new life as the woman who brought down a dynasty and rose from the ashes carrying 3 miracles that proved her strength had never been in question. 5 years after the press conference that detonated the Sullivan Empire, Mia stood backstage at the Lucas Sullivan Memorial Center's annual gala, wearing a dress that cost more than her old studio apartment's yearly rent, watching her triplets, Sophia, Elena, and Lucas, named for the people who'd saved her and the uncle whose genetics they carried, chase each other around the green room with the boundless energy of 5-year-olds who'd never known a day of being called inadequate. Ruth Sullivan had died 3 weeks after the hospice confession, her obituary carefully edited by the family's PR team, but forever linked to the scandal that had stripped the Sullivan name of its untouchable status. And in the years since, Mia had watched their empire restructure under federal investigation, their charitable foundation placed under independent oversight, and Jack Sullivan quietly relocate to Seattle, where he worked at a nonprofit and sent birthday cards to the triplets that Mia saved in a box for when they were old enough to decide if they wanted a relationship with the man who'd failed their mother but seemed genuinely committed to becoming better. The criminal charges against Mia had been dropped within 48 hours of Dr. Chen's confession, replaced with charges against Ruth's estate and Dr. Chen herself, though the doctor had received a plea deal in exchange for testimony that had reformed medical consent laws across 3 states. And Mia had used her settlement from the Sullivan family, $27 million after Sophia's aggressive litigation, to fund her doctorate in reproductive ethics and establish a foundation for women wrongly blamed for fertility issues. Ethan appeared beside her now, adjusted the bow tie that he still couldn't quite get comfortable wearing to formal events, and pressed a kiss to her temple that felt like coming home after 5 years of building a life together that started with crisis and evolved into the kind of love that grew stronger in sunlight, instead of just surviving in storms. The twins just asked if they're too young to give a speech about how their mama is the bravest person in the whole world. And I didn't have the heart to tell them that's literally what you're about to do, he said, his eyes warm with the pride that never got old, no matter how many times Mia saw it. They'd gotten married 2 years ago in a small ceremony with Sophia as maid of honor and the triplets as the world's most chaotic wedding party. And Ethan had adopted them legally 6 months later, giving them a father who chose them deliberately instead of being connected by accident of genetics. "You ready to face the Atlanta elite who used to pretend you didn't exist?" he asked softly, knowing that despite all her success and vindication, walking back into the world that had rejected her still required courage. Mia looked through the stage curtain at the ballroom filled with Georgia's wealthiest families, many of whom had sat silent at that long-ago dinner table while Ruth Sullivan called her Barren, and felt not nervousness, but a fierce satisfaction that time and truth had transformed into power. "I'm ready," she said, squeezing Ethan's hand before stepping onto the stage to applause. That felt like acknowledgement, like apology. like the world finally recognizing what she'd always known about her own worth. Her speech was about medical ethics and patient advocacy, about the 300 women who'd contacted her foundation with similar stories of being blamed for male factor infertility, about the legislation she'd helped pass, requiring mandatory testing for both partners before any fertility diagnosis. But what resonated most was when she gestured to the triplets sitting front row with Sophia and said, "These three miracles exist because I refuse to accept someone else's narrative about my body, and every woman deserves that same fierce ownership of her truth." The standing ovation lasted 3 minutes, and when Mia looked out at the crowd, she saw Jack in the back row, clapping with tears streaming down his face. Finally understanding what he'd lost and what she'd gained by walking away. After the gala, Ethan drove them home to the house they'd bought in Virginia Highland, close enough to Atlanta to attend events like tonight, but far enough to build their own life, separate from Sullivan's shadow. And Mia watched him carry a sleeping Sophia inside, while Elena and Lucas debated whether unicorns or dragons were cooler with the seriousness of philosophers. This was the victory Ruth Sullivan had never imagined. Not just the triplets who proved Mia's fertility was never in question. Not just the career and the money and the public vindication, but the quiet joy of a life built on truth instead of lies. Of a family chosen with intention instead of obligation. Of a love that started in a records room uncovering conspiracy and grew into something stable enough to weather anything. Sophia appeared on the porch with the bottle of wine and 3 glasses, one for her, one for Ethan, and sparkling cider for Mia. Because, surprise, there was a 4th miracle, currently 6 weeks along, and this time conceived in love instead of manipulation. To the woman who burned down an empire and built something better from the ashes, Sophia toasted. Her fierce loyalty, undimmed by half a decade of friendship tested by fire and refined into something unbreakable. Mia clinked glasses with her best friend and her husband, watched her children sleep safely in a home filled with love instead of judgment, and felt the final piece of her healing click into place because this chaotic, beautiful, hard-won life was worth every moment of the darkness that had preceded it. The girl who'd been thrown out in the rain no longer existed, replaced by Dr. Mia Hunt, mother of 4, advocate for thousands, wife to a man who chose her every single day, and living proof that the people who try to break you don't get to write your ending. And if you're still watching, if this story resonated with you, or made you think about someone in your life who's been told they're not enough, drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. Because I love hearing how these stories impact you. And seriously, if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because next week's story is about a woman who discovered her perfect husband, had a whole second family, and the revenge she orchestrated is absolutely legendary. Mia's story ended not with revenge, but with redemption. Not with bitterness, but with the sweetest possible victory. A life so full of love and purpose that the people who'd rejected her became irrelevant to her happiness, and 3, soon to be 4, beautiful children who would grow up knowing their mother's strength was never in question, only waiting for the world to catch up to what she'd always known about herself.